This is 6.2 sponges, cnidarians, flatworms, and roundworms. Kind of a catch-all. Good times, let's do it. So we're talking about sponges. Sponges are the simplest of all animals. They only share the most basic animal characteristics with all other animals, meaning that multicellular, eukaryotic, heterotrophic cells don't have cell walls kind of thing. That was about it. They're aquatic, meaning they require water for all of their essential functions. So how does that work? Well, they kind of filter water through their bodies. They have these specialized cells that you don't need to know the names of, and they basically filter water through their bodies, causing it to go in the sides, out the top, and this allows them to do things like circulation, respiration, excretion, all those things that we talked about, those essential functions. They're basically pumping water through their system, which is pretty interesting. Sponges spend most of their life sessile, which sessile is a new word. It means not moving. They're just going to sit there. Just sit there. Now, sponges can sexually reproduce by creating gametes, sperm and egg combined, that whole thing. And then the larva is just a special term for like a baby. The larva can actually swim. So at this point in a sponge's life, they're actually able to swim. They'll park, they'll find a place, and they'll live there for hundreds of years because they live a long time. Now, sponges are also able to asexually reproduce by like fragmentation. We're actually going to mention fragmentation later, so I'll save it till then. And but otherwise, pretty simple. They're sessile. They do not move. Ecology. Ecology is a big word for like how they interact with their environments. We're going to talk about ecology for several of the organisms that we go over. Sponges provide habitat for other animals. Here you see this fish is just kind of chilling in the sponge. I mean, wouldn't we all like to do that? So sponges, that's it. Cnidarians. So cnidarians are like jellies, sea anemones, corals, other things like that. Soft-bodied aquatic carnivorous animals, necessarily carnivorous, meaning they're eating other animals, and they use stinging tentacles to capture prey. Where do these things come from? Well, they have these specialized cells called cnidocytes. Cnidocyte is a cell that creates this stinging kind of barb that releases venom, paralyzes their prey. There's this little hair-like projection you see there on that picture, and it basically is like a little mousetrap. It's not as if the jelly is like coming at you, trying to sting you. It doesn't think. It's just covered with these barbs. When it brushes up against something, it puts them in something that paralyzes that thing, usually pulls it up into its stomach. What does that look like? Well, we'll get there in just a second. There are two primary body forms in cnidarians. There's the medusa body form, which is the motile body form, or the one that's able to move. And then there is the polyp form. Polyp is typically a sessile form, meaning that it is unable to move. It will spend its life that way. Now, some cnidarians have both a polyp and a medusa form, and some are either or, meaning like there's no known polyp form for some of them or known medusa form for some of them either. How do they feed? Well, it's a little different. They have kind of like what you would think of as a mouth, the single opening goes into this cavity called a gastrovascular cavity. So their digestive system just has one opening. And unlike most animals that have two, and the food just kind of goes in there and slowly digests, kind of like sarlacc. And how do they respond? Well, they don't really have a brain. They just have what we call a nerve net. And the nerve net is basically, it's able to respond to things like light and movement. And so it's able to respond generally to its environment, but it's not doing any kind of processing. It's not doing any kind of thinking. It just kind of is responding in a very general way. And as far as ecology is concerned, there's this kind of cnidarian called a coral, and corals create reefs over time, and these reefs are essentially like the rainforests of the ocean. There's a lot of biodiversity found in coral reefs, and so they provide structure for ecosystems and habitat for organisms. Very cool, cnidarians. Flatworms are next. These are soft, flattened worms, if you can believe that. And they have tissues. Tissues, remember, are made of groups of cells. This is going to make them different than some of the other things we've talked about. Now, cnidarians have tissues as well, but we're going to talk specifically about why the tissues are important for flatworms, because they have three tissue layers. They have bilateral symmetry and cephalization. We didn't talk about the symmetry for Cnidarians. I do want to mention that briefly. Cnidarians have radial symmetry, and so this means that they have more than one line of symmetry. Flatworms, bilateral symmetry. Flatworms are considered acoelomate, which means that they do not have a coelom. And you're thinking, what's a coelom? Well, it looks like coelom first. It's not coelom, it's coelom. Coelom is just a fancy word for a body cavity. And so flatworms are acoelomate, which means they do not have a body cavity. You can see the three tissue layers here, the ecto, meso, and endoderm. These are important words. Ecto is outermost, meso is middle, endo is inside. That's all we're going to get to in this class. And so there's no cavity separating these three tissue layers, but they do have three tissue layers, which makes them a little different. How do they feed? Well, they have this thing called an external pharynx, which if you can imagine kind of like having a tube that led down to your stomach, but you didn't have it in your mouth. So you just had it kind of coming out of your chest and you were able to vacuum up food with that. That's what these guys have. And notice food and waste go and leave the same area. So they're not very, advanced, but that's okay. We're not going to judge. And what about excretion? They have these cells called flame cells, and flame cells are interesting because they kind of act like kidneys. They do a little bit of that nitrogenous waste removal, and they control the amount of water that are in these organisms, which is important. So it's kind of like a primitive sort of kidney in a way. What about for response? Well, you do see a little bit of cephalization with flatworms, meaning that you do have the beginnings of the formation of a head and some kind of gathering of nerves there. You can see the word ganglia there, which is kind of a fancy word for like a bundle of nerves. Some pictures of flatworms, you'll actually see the word brain there. Just looking here. There's central ganglia or cerebral ganglia. So you get the idea. So it's just a gathering of nerves. It's kind of some centralization starting to happen, but not really. These don't have a head in the way that you would think that we normally think of a head, right? Where if you cut the head off of something, it's kind of gone because all that central processing is gone. They don't. In fact, if you cut the head off of a flatworm, that head will grow a new body and the body will grow a new head. This is called fragmentation. It's a way of asexually reproducing. Flatworms are able to reproduce sexually like all other animals, but they're also able to asexually reproduce using fragmentation, which is where you like cut it up and it just grows new parts. Obviously, that has some limitation, but apparently you can do it 3 times. This picture tells us anyway. We should believe this cartoon picture. What are some examples? There's some free-living flatworms, like you see there on the left. It's marine, typically, meaning they're in the ocean. A lot of flatworms are parasites. So the one on the bottom right is a tapeworm. Lives inside the digestive tract of its host and just eats. Slowly gets longer. It's kind of gross. And then there's some called flukes, which are in the upper right there. Flukes typically have 2 hosts, not always. We could get into some flatworms, but we're not. But they basically feed off of their host, and they rely on a host in order to complete their life cycle. That's flatworms. Roundworms. Why are they called round? Well, look at it. Looks kind of like canned spaghetti in a little bit. These are unsegmented worms with a pseudocoelom and a full digestive tract. Let's talk about those things. So a pseudocoelom, there's that word coelom, body cavity. Pseudo means false, right? So they have a false cavity. What does that mean? They have a cavity, as you can see, but it is not completely lined with mesoderm. And so a true coelom is completely lined with mesoderm, which we're going to see with segmented worms. But false coelom is not completely lined. You can see there's some mesoderm there, but it doesn't line the inner tract, and so we call that a false coelom or a pseudocoelom. A couple things here to add for roundworms. Roundworms have a full digestive tract, meaning that their digestive tract has 2 openings, as opposed to flatworms and Cnidarians that have this single opening with kind of this gastrovascular cavity. They have 2 openings, and that tube goes all the way through that organism, which is still common with humans and other more advanced animals today. Reproduction. Interesting thing for roundworms is they have something called internal fertilization. They have separate sexes and they have internal fertilization. This is where fertilization occurs inside the organism. We're going to talk about external fertilization with some other animals, but roundworms have internal fertilization. This is not necessarily a sign of advancement because, like I said, there's some more advanced organisms that have external fertilization, but this is just a new thing, so we're going to mention it, internal fertilization there. And ecology. Roundworms are the cause of lots of disease. Many disease-causing roundworms. Heartworms are a great example. That's why I have this picture. But there are many that cause disease in humans as well. In fact, it is estimated that probably a third of the human population is infected with some kind of worm, and that kind of worm is likely a roundworm. So it's a real problem. Roundworms have these other ecologies, but most roundworms are parasitic, meaning that they require a host in order to live.